A vegetarian is someone who does not eat meat or poultry, some would say even fish. Vegan diet is where you don't have any dairy product, no milk, no cheese, and nothing derived from non-vegetarian sources. So vegetarians might eat milk and cheese and some dairy products, eggs, poultry product, and the vegans would eat none of that. So we're using the term vegetarian in that sense. And we'll be talking about three groups of people: those who are vegetarians or vegans on one side, secular people who would generally be evolutionists on one side, second side, and then biblical people, Jews, Christians, who would be theists, who would hold that God has created animals, He owns them, as a third group. So we're talking about three different groups. And I'm going to be arguing as we go along that actually vegetarians and biblical Christians, Jews and Christians, are much closer to each other in their attitude to animals than the secular evolutionists. This whole series is entitled Postmodern West Meets Pre-Modern East. Vegetarianism is, in some ways, a reaction to modernism, by which I mean secularism, an outlook on life which assumes evolution, that all life is an accident. Animals are accidental products of chance. No one created them. They aren't precious to anyone. No one really cares for them. In fact, the whole process of evolution is driven by a fierce struggle for existence, and the fittest survive. So in that struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, some life forms, all life forms, in fact, eat other life forms for their survival. So devouring other life forms is a part of the evolutionary process. So one anthropologist at the University of California in Berkeley, for example, argues that some primates evolved to becoming human beings because they started eating meat. They first started cracking bones to eat the bone marrow, and then the muscle tissues, which were rich in protein, and therefore they started to develop this complex brain that human beings have and social patterns that we have. So eating meat is the key to turning some primates into human beings. If we hadn't been eating meat, we wouldn't be humans, we would be monkeys. This is their argument. So the modern mindset, which thinks that animals are products of blind chance, nobody created them, they aren't precious or valuable to anybody, they are just there, they can be discarded, they can be destroyed, and there is nothing ethical or unethical about killing or eating animals. That whole mindset is repulsive to a lot of people who are reacting against that cruelty to animals. And the problem obviously becomes that if Jesus blessed the non-vegetarian diet, He Himself broke fish and gave people fish to eat, was He justifying, sanctifying cruelty to animals? How could He be an ethical person, a righteous person, if He was justifying cruelty to animals? So Christians tend to join the group of the secularists, evolutionists, against the vegetarians and defend eating meat flippantly, casually, and bracket themselves with in the block with the secularists. Though, as we will go along, I hope by the end of the evening you would see that biblical Christianity is in fact more on the side of the vegetarians who oppose cruelty to animals, because animals are precious to God. So the question at one level, because this is today is a study on ethics, the question is killing animals for food intrinsically unethical? Is killing animals for food unethical because it's cruel? And believe it or not, by the end my argument is going to be that vegetarianism is crueler, far more cruel to animals than eating meat. And that's the heart of my argument, so you have to prepare yourself for an intellectual roller coaster ride. And I'm sure we will have lively discussion on that point. The issue obviously is not as simple as one might like to think, because there are many food scientists. I've named one, Stephen Davis, professor of animal science from Oregon State University. He points out in his calculations that if we were eating cows and lambs that graze in open fields, if we were killing and eating them, the Americans would kill 300 million animals less than if we were growing grain in those pasture lands. In one study, he found that just one mowing in alfalfa field reduced the mice by 50%. And each plowing and mowing and harvesting destroys animal life. Now, you might say that life of a cow is a lot more valuable than life of a rat, but that is your arbitrary judgment. There are a lot of Hindus who worship rats. For them, a rat is a god. You don't kill rat, because all life is divine. So you might think that cow is a lot more valuable than those rats or rabbits or pheasants or others that what happens is that as tractor comes, they go into their holes, but then the tractor goes deep enough and kills them. So if you were growing grain in those fields, you are killing 300 million more animals by growing grain than by just letting cows and lambs graze there, and you kill them for food. So it's not a very simple issue as you might think. The ethical questions involve, you might say that, well, that is an accidental killing or collateral damage. We don't see their pain, but we see the pain of a cow being butchered. Well, okay, so it's about your feelings. It's not about the facts of killing animals. In other words, you're reducing ethics to the question of feeling. Well, what I feel bad about is unethical. Well, what happens if somebody feels good about killing animals? Killing ducks or fishing, if it gives him pleasure, why is his feeling less valuable than yours? Because if it gives him pleasure, then that's ethical for him. So something is unethical for you, some opposite is ethical for him. Ethics is all relative. Who are you to impose your ethical values on everybody else? That would be the classical argument of ethical relativism. So the question is not as simple as it appears at first glance. The major issues, if we go directly to the case for vegetarianism, is that many people feel today the part of this reaction against secularism or disenchantment of the world that we have been talking about, that secularization created a non-enchanted world, a world from where spirit, sacredness, divinity disappear. And part of the postmodern spirituality is to re-enchant nature, that nature should be held sacred. Now, what does that mean? For some people, it means that we've got to begin to look at all nature as sacred, as divine, and then we would begin to treat it with respect. An alternative, obviously, is that sacredness is a question of value. We have to distinguish the question of substance from the question of value. Is a cow or a rat God, or is it sacred? This is a building. The sanctuary is a building. You can have a dance here. You might not like to have a rock and roll dance or any other kind of dance in the sanctuary except for worship dance. Why? Because you would say, well, you're going to have a party in this hall because this is secular hall. That is sacred. Isn't God present here? Yes, God is present here, God is present there. But that particular building, if it's a temple or a mosque or a church, we have dedicated it to God, so we have made it sacred, and making something sacred is our value. We have imputed that value to it. We have not imputed that value to this, although both are just buildings, but that building is sacred because we've dedicated it to God. It belongs to God, therefore it's valuable. Now that's the difference between, let's say, a marriage or a partnership. A marriage is a relationship that we have offered to God, dedicated to God, therefore it is sacred, and to violate it is sin. But a live-in partnership may not have been dedicated to anyone. This is our contract, this is our agreement, and this is, it can be terminated as any other contract. So this relationship is not sacred, that relationship is sacred. These are our values that we impute. So this question of vegetarianism then becomes a philosophical question, that is life sacred, or what makes it sacred? And those are the questions that we will answer. But let's take the arguments very quickly in favor of vegetarianism. There are secular arguments, and I'm using the word secular in the sense of non-religious arguments in favor of vegetarianism. Essentially, when I use the word secularism, and secular generally, I mean Protestant liberalism. A liberal Protestantism which rejects the authority of the Bible. The authority of human reason supersedes the authority of the Bible. So secularism is a product of Protestantism. As Protestantism turned away from the Bible, it became liberal, and the West became secular. So it is in some ways still Christian, but it is liberal Christian. But right now, when I'm using the word secular, I'm using it more as an Indian sense. In India, the word secular simply means non-religious. So the first non-religious argument in favor of vegetarianism is that vegetarianism is ethical because it is better for our nutrition and our health. Man was created vegetarian, or fruitarian rather. There are a lot of animals, even some mighty dinosaurs, who derived all their nutrition, all their amazing strength from the vegetable kingdom. So you can be an elephant and live purely on vegetables. So a vegetarian diet can, in fact, meet all our nutritional needs. The problem normally is that it requires a lot of knowledge and understanding, money and time and resources and effort to have a balanced vegetarian diet, which most people don't have that information. And if you have the information, you don't necessarily have the time to do all the shopping and all the classifying and all the cooking that is needed to have the balanced diet. And therefore, even in a place like Loma Linda with the brilliant Seventh-day Adventist hospital, strong emphasis on vegetarian diet, all the information, all the finances available, the overall study shows that in America, people who only eat vegetarian food are deficient in their diet simply because they don't have the time, they don't have the skills, the information, the money, the efforts. And this is especially true of young people who in their high schools or early college get fascinated with vegetarianism for ethical reasons or spiritual reasons or metaphysical reasons, but they don't have the money and they don't have the time to buy right and to cook right. Or they might be dependent on their parents to do the shopping. Now, if a woman has to cook meat for her husband and a vegetarian diet for her children, then she may not just have the time and the energy to do a good job for meet both the needs. So children end up eating vegetarian junk food, and you can have a non-vegetarian junk food or you can have vegetarian junk food, and then the children are physically weaker because they are dependent on adults to do the shopping for them and to do the cooking for them. And particularly very small children, those who are breastfed, if the mother is vegan and she's not giving breastfeeding or using fortified formulas, then the child will very often lack certain nutrients that are necessary for their growth, particularly for their vision and development of certain forms of their bodies. In Loma Linda, they found that the Seventh-day Adventists tend to have more their skeleton is weaker, they might live longer, but they have more bone fractures, etc. So, in theory is okay, practice is another problem. So, this is an interesting change. 100 years ago, in India, Mahatma Gandhi started eating meat because it was a popular view in India that the British have colonized us because the British eat meat and we eat lentils, so we are weaker. We eat vegetarian food and they eat non-vegetarian food, therefore they are stronger. So people started eating vegetarian, non-vegetarian food. But then Mahatma Gandhi changed and he became a vegetarian when he went to England, because what happened in a very brief history of modern vegetarianism. One landmark was Leo Tolstoy, the Russian idealist. His book his essay rather, The Morals of Diet, or The First Step, that was his Russian title. It was printed as a preface in Howard Williams' book called The Ethics of Diet, which had a huge impact on Mahatma Gandhi when he went to England and then returned to vegetarianism. As a result of these books and these writings, the International Vegetarian Union was formed in Germany in 1908, and then it began fashionable. George Bernard Shaw, who won a Nobel Prize for Literature, he wrote, "We are the living graves of murdered beasts, slaughtered to satisfy our appetites. We never pause to wonder at our feasts if animals like man can possibly have rights." The question of whether animals have rights really came from him. And then he had a huge influence on Mahatma Gandhi, whose Gandhi's autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, is substantially an apology for vegetarianism. And then Gandhi's impact, global impact, began to give in the 1940s and 50s a huge boost to the vegetarian movement. That's a very brief overview. Obviously, the history of vegetarianism in India goes back to the time of Mahavir and Buddha, 6-7 centuries before Christ. Hinduism was not vegetarian, and Hindus did eat cow, and cows were sacrificed. Brahmins ate cows, and that whole sacrificial system degenerated into cruelty to animals, that priests enjoyed killing and eating cows and all kinds of animals. And vegetarianism of Jainism and Buddhism were reactions against that cruelty. And just like before them, a number of prophets such as Isaiah, and we will look at his passages in a few minutes, had condemned the Jewish practice of sacrificing animals as cruel, brutal, abomination before God, because the whole system of animal sacrifice in Judaism had also degenerated into cruelty. So it was that mindset which also came to India. The important thing which many in what was called the New Age movement in the 1990s, what they don't realize or recognize is that Jainism and Buddhism, their concern was not for animals, their concern was for their own spirituality, themselves. There was no protest against cruelty to animals in India. There was, in fact, no ecological movement in India. They were not simply protesting, they were not just denying themselves animal meat, they were denying themselves all food. In Jainism, ultimate spirituality was to discard all clothes, to be nude, and finally to eat nothing and starve yourself to death, because righteousness was something that you attained with your own effort, abstinence. And this was in a sense, the essence of Tolstoy argument in that essay, that God's grace is not sufficient for righteousness. We need to exert effort to become righteous, and the first step in our obtaining righteousness is what he called abstinence. And in abstinence, the first thing is abstinence in food, And in abstinence in food, the first thing is to abstain from animal meat. But then he went on to abstain from all kinds of things, including hot waters, because in those days servants have to work hard to provide hot water to their masters. So it is a luxury for which other people have to labor. Therefore, we must avoid these kinds of luxuries. We must inflict suffering upon ourselves to become righteous. This was his point of view, which Mahatma Gandhi took over and perpetuated. So, to return to the non-religious argument in favor of vegetarianism, one of the arguments is that it is better for nutrition and better for health. In theory, that may very well be true, because meat diet is obviously related to cholesterol, to saturated fats, to low fiber, and it's related to blood pressure, heart attack, related to certain kind of cancers. The other side of the story obviously is that every successive generation of American has been taller and stronger than previous generations, substantially because of the meat diet. So the Japanese or the others, the Chinese who would come here, they would become stronger and taller because of the American diet. So when all is said and done, the jury is still out, and the issue, if you took a sample of, let's say, 100 vegetarians and 100 non-vegetarians at random in America and compared their health, overall finding generally is that the vegetarian diet is deficient, not because it is intrinsically so, but as I mentioned, because it's very hard to have a balanced vegetarian diet given all the constraints of life. The second set of arguments, the non-religious arguments in favor of vegetarianism, are from ecology and economy. We had a Minister of State for our central government, Mrs. Maneka Gandhi, no relationship to Mahatma Gandhi, except that she was married into Mrs. Indira Gandhi's family, who again was not related to Mahatma Gandhi. And she became our first green politician, and she used to always say that eating 1 kilo of chicken is consuming 35 kilos of grain, and this is destroying green cover in India. In America, they say that 85% of all corn is fed to the animals. Now, as far as the green cover issue is concerned, if that 85% of corn was not being fed to animals, if there were animals weren't being fed corn, farmers simply wouldn't grow that corn. The argument is that if this corn was given to the poor, there will be no hunger in this world. That's obviously true. But the problem is that the poor do not have the means of purchasing that corn. You can't expect the farmers to grow corn and ship it at their own expense for free. Somebody has to pay for it. Who will pay for it? If nobody is going to pay that corn is being grown because somebody is willing to buy. If nobody is willing to buy, then farmers will simply have to turn their lands into commercial complexes or golf courses or something else. To grow corn requires irrigation, requires taking care of the soil. The end result will be that you will actually have less green cover, both in India and here, if human beings were not exerting the effort necessary to cultivate corn. So the argument really is a spurious one. It isn't true, because both ecologically and economically, if that market wasn't there and if that effort wasn't there, we will have less economy and less productive economy. You might be playing golf on those golf courses, but that's not necessarily an economically productive use of land, and you will have, as I said, less green cover. So, while each of these arguments deserves to be looked at carefully, they don't clinch the issue in one way or the other. So, the real issues boil down to more what I call metaphysical issues, and those are the ones that we need to consider today. One is the non-vegetarian diet is unnatural for human beings. We aren't created to eat meat. You know, we don't have the claws and we don't have the teeth that are needed to eat meat like the lions do, the bears do. Our saliva is not acidic enough to digest meat. We normally have to cook in order to eat meat. So, eating meat is unnatural, and this was a strong point with Mahatma Gandhi, that we need to live naturally. But the problem with that is, first of all, it is actually true that man was not created to eat meat. In Genesis chapter 1, we read that when God created Adam and Eve, He blessed them and He gave them fruit and seed-bearing plant. The green plant, vegetation, was given to animals. They can eat it naturally. Cows can eat grass, we can't. If our children don't like eating spinach, it's because that's not natural human food. We have to season it, we have to cook it before we can, or cultivate taste for it, before we can enjoy it. So, it is unnatural, but the other side of it is that we are not naturally made to fly, but we fly. We are not naturally made to go into the depths of the sea, but we do. Why? Because it is in fact natural for us to be creative. You may not want to believe that man is made in the image of the Creator, but the reality is that we are creative creatures. We are not just creatures, we are creative creatures. We are the only species that creates culture. Why are we creative? And part of our creativity means that food that we cannot eat naturally, we can cook, we can season it and make it palatable for ourselves. To demand that man should not be creative is to require us to live unnaturally, because to be creative is natural for us. And as we go along in a few minutes, we will see that in fact the argument breaks down because today we don't live in the natural environment which God had created. Nature has changed, and we talked about it, I think, in the last lecture when I said that we are the only species that is ashamed of ourselves. We wear clothes. That's unnatural. If God wanted us to wear clothes, He would have given us hair or fur. He didn't. We don't live naturally because the world is no longer natural. And this is what has changed the question of diet. But we'll come to that in a moment. So, I call these metaphysical arguments because if you pursue each of these arguments, you find that behind what is being said, what appears at first glance to be sensible, there are a lot of other assumptions and a lot of other practices. Like Mahatma Gandhi, for example, he would ask you not to eat meat, but he would drink his urine first thing in the morning, and that urine therapy has become a very forceful movement that, including some of our prime ministers who followed Mahatma Gandhi, were trained by him, would do that first thing in the morning. A member of parliament, a very brilliant man, a very good friend of mine, who has held very important positions in the government of India at the senior most cabinet level, does that every morning, and he, in evangelizing other members of parliament to become urine drinking naturalists, he would drink their urine to persuade them to that this is good. So there is a whole naturopathy philosophy behind it which deserves discussion, but I won't go into all of that right now, because that's going too far away from our topic. But the point is that there is truth, but the truth is not as simple as it appears in first glance, because what we are being asked is to become unnatural and not use our creativity. Second argument in favor of vegetarianism often is that you are what you eat. This was very important in some Hindu sects that became vegetarian, and Buddhism and Jainism, that if you eat meat, you become aggressive, passionate, cruel. If you eat vegetarian food, you are not only healthy, but you are even-tempered, kind, gentler person. Shelley, the poet, made this very passionate argument 8 months after he had been a vegetarian. You are what you eat. So initially, Mahatma Gandhi also fell for this argument, but later he changed when Hitler, who was a fanatic vegetarian, became an embarrassment to the vegetarian movement. And Gandhi then made a very strong argument that this whole case that your diet shapes your character is a false case, because as Jesus put it, that what makes you unclean is not what goes into you from outside, but what comes out of you. The greed, the lust, the covetousness, the lies, the deception, etc. That's what makes you unclean, the moral choices and intentions that you have. So the whole idea that diet is related to righteousness may be true, but essentially righteousness is a matter of inner decisions and choices that we make. The third argument, which is metaphysical argument, is more occultic. Occult means hidden. Like Shirley MacLaine, she argues for vegetarianism, but her argument is very simple. She is a moral relativist, that there are no absolute morals, so she can't say that eating meat is immoral. All that she can say is that I have a spirit guide, and my spirit guide told me that if I want to keep my channel of communication clear with him, I need to eat only vegetables and eat in moderation. Now this was in fact more sophisticated and developed cosmology in theosophy. Annie Besant and her successors, they argued that we have the material body, then there is the astral world, the spirit world. So the animals and vegetables also have spirits, and when we kill animals, their spirits are tortured and haunted, and they keep hovering over the butcher houses and over cities. And if cities are very oppressive, it's because a lot of meat, a lot of animals are being butchered there every day, and their spirits are terrified and angry and frustrated and aggressive, and therefore there is all the urban problems come because of these problems in the spirit world. Now, the two problems with that perspectives are that the same people are telling us that everything is spiritual. It's not just cows and lambs and fish that have spirits, but also carrots and cabbages. So what happens to their spirits? Why do you boil them and torture them? I'm not making fun of the vegetarians, because I'm pretty soon going to be defending them and arguing that the Bible is in fact on their side. What I'm attacking is the silly arguments that are very often used to advance a cause which may in fact be a good cause. Now, one of such arguments again is that all life is equally divine. In that case, carrots and cabbages are as divine as cows and pigs, and there is no real reason that you can eat one and not eat the other. And the confusion here is the confusion between the word sacred and divine. Animals are sacred, as we will see in a few minutes, but they are not divine. They are not God. Man is precious, man is valuable, human life is sacred, but man is not God. So, because this is a value that the Creator gives, or we give, it is not, and we mustn't confuse substance with value. And that's a statement that I will hopefully discuss as we go along. But finally and briefly, another spurious argument is, of course, from karma and reincarnation. The reason they say we shouldn't kill animals is because animals also have souls, and their souls reincarnate. You're killing a lamb, and that lamb may be your grandfather. But then the problem is the carrot could be your grandmother. But the difficulty really comes is that, okay, in my previous life, I was the chicken, and you ate me, and now you are the chicken, I'm eating you. So this is cosmic justice working itself out. And so I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm just administering cosmic justice. So this argument goes nowhere. The issue that really matters is the issue of cruelty. That all of these arguments might be silly, they may have no substance, but the fact is that killing an animal is cruel. It's inflicting pain on that animal, and therefore it's unethical. Now there are, but this again has a philosophical dimension, that here in UCLA every year you have students who are protesting against research on animals, and the university now has to invest a lot of money in protecting its labs and protecting professors and researchers. It's getting costlier and costlier because the protests keep getting uglier. And then there are religious people who are protesting against embryonic stem cell research, that this embryo is a potential human being, image of God. This has fundamental human rights. So do animals have rights? There has been no universal declaration of animal rights as yet, but the young people who are protesting against cruelty to animals, they might want United Nations to pass a universal charter of animal rights. The problem with that is, how are you going to educate lions that the deer in the wilderness have rights that lions should respect? Now, obviously, you can't teach that. So, here is a language of human rights being borrowed, hijacked, and applied in a comical way. What you can talk about is human responsibility, not animal rights, but human responsibility. Do human beings have responsibility to take care of animals, to treat animals with love, with care, with compassion, with kindness, with gentleness, protect them? Is that a human responsibility? Is that a human obligation? Now, that is a legitimate question, because obviously if deers have right to life, then lions shouldn't be taking it. But that becomes a ridiculous proposition. But do human beings have responsibilities towards animals? That sense of responsibility is a legitimate question, and this is where a Christian would not be on the side of the evolutionists and secularists and modernists. We would be on the side of the activists who fight against cruelty to animals. Why? Because as you begin to look into the Bible, you see that on the fifth day, when God creates the fish and the birds, He blesses the fish and the birds. The kind of blessing that He gives to man to be fruitful, to replenish, fill the waters, fill the air, which is very similar to the blessing given to man, except that human beings, the blessing goes on to say that you subdue the earth and then you rule over the fish and the birds and the animals and everything else. The authority to rule, to govern, to manage is given to us. It's not given to them. But the blessing to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the waters and fill the air and fill the land, that blessing has been given to animals as well. So the first point, God creates animals, including fish and birds, and He looks at them and He says that this is good. He's very pleased with them. 2, He blesses them. He wants them to grow. He doesn't want them to be killed and destroyed and annihilated. That's very clear from the scriptures. So, if we are godly, if we want to be godlike, we want animal kingdom and the fish and the bird to grow, to multiply, to fill. We want to protect them because this is what God wants. We want to hold them as good, as valuable, as precious. Anything which is a product of chance has no value. Anything which is a product of creativity has value. Let me illustrate it. Many years ago, I think it was 1983, for the first time as a family, we came out. We were traveling in England. We were traveling in Europe. So the first halt was in England, and we were living in the village, serving the poor. There was no school in the village, so our children were being homeschooled. But when we came to England, staying with a friend, our children went to their children's schools. That was the first day in school. And our younger daughter came back, and she was very excited. She said, "Look, I made these ducks." Now, I looked at what she had made, and to me, it didn't even look like a camel. It was duck. Now, while the children were at school, we were living with really poor people in the village. So my wife had one opportunity now to go shopping. And of course, there was no money to go to big shops. So she was going to second-hand shops in this little town, Oxfam shops and Salvation Army shops, and getting everything that she could. So she collected a lot of material from these second-hand shops. And when the time came for us to leave England, come to America, I said, well, there is only one coolie in this tourist party and 3 ladies, so we cannot carry junk. Now I began to discard some of the junk which Ruth had collected, and in that I was also discarding these ducks. My daughter got very upset at me. She said, "This is not junk, this is my ducks." Now, I suddenly realized that because she made them, they were important to her. So whatever is a product of chance is not important to anyone, it just happened. But whatever is created is valuable to whoever created it. You know, when your wife cooks a dinner, even if you don't like it, you better say it's great. Because whoever made it, has exerted effort, thought, creativity, and you have to appreciate that labor. So, God made animals, they're valuable to Him. They're not product of blind chance. Not only God made animals, but in Genesis chapter 1, we read that God gave man fruit and seed-bearing plants, but He gave the green plants to animals. So there was no competition for food between man and animals. We were supposed to coexist together, and that's the picture in the Garden of Eden. All the animals come to Adam, they're not afraid of him. He names them, he categorizes them, he studies them, he's friends with them. That's Eden, where the wolf and the lamb can lie down together and play together. But in Genesis chapter 3, sin enters. Man rebels. Original sin is ecological sin. Man has overstepped the limits of his authority over nature. The tree of the knowledge of the fruit of good and evil, knowledge of good and evil, is a daily reminder, constant reminder, that Adam has authority over this garden. He can eat any fruit he likes, but his authority is derived, it's given to him, it is limited, it stops with this tree. He is not the monarch of all that he surveys. He is not the Lord, he is a steward, he is a manager. He's vice regent, he's responsible, he's accountable to someone else. And I illustrated it like, I come to your home, you very friendly, you say, make yourself at home, help yourself to anything you like. Now you don't mean that I should help myself to your credit card and use it as I like. There are limits. I have authority, you've given it to me, but there are limits because it's not my house. And that's what Adam is being taught. But when he eats that fruit, he says, no, I'm going to be the Lord. He's defying God's authority. I'm going to be the boss. I'm going to use nature as I like. And that's why the curse comes. And we looked at the curse last time, that the earth will now grow thorns and thistles, and you will have to eat of the sweat of your brow. For those of you who were not there last week, I said that this is the command. The curse is also ecological. What it means is that now Adam will have to work very hard. He will have to be bonded to Adamah, the earth, much more tightly. If he wants to eat, if he wants to live, he has to take much better care of this earth. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to live. So the curse is in fact a blessing upon the earth, because man has abused his authority over the earth. God is now forcing man to take better care of the earth. And in that process, if the earth is going to grow thorns and thistles, its productivity is decreased, you will have to eat of the sweat of your brow. What it means is that animals will now hurt, because if earth is growing less food, they will not have enough food. So God says that now in Genesis chapter 3, that now I give you green plants which I had given to animals, I give you to eat. That's a blessing, but that's also a blessing to the animals. If the productivity has gone down, the productivity of the soil has gone down, the temptation for Adam and Eve and their descendants would be to only grow their own food, which is fruit, which cows can't eat. But if we are eating what animals eat, then we will grow animal food as well. So man has to now grow food for the animals. The curse part of it is that a competition sets in between man and animals for the food. So if all those rats are there in our fields, it's because we are now growing their food as well. We are responsible to grow their food. So the curse is also a blessing. It's redemptive and it's ecological. But in Genesis chapter 4, Cain kills his brother Abel. And God says that this ground that has swallowed your brother's blood is crying out for justice. So there is curse on you. Earth is not going to grow food, enough food for you. So the productivity goes further down as a result of our sin. And we developed this theme last week again. So if you weren't here, please do look at that lecture. That sin has ecological consequences, and therefore Christians have to be concerned for the environment, because it's our sin which results in curse upon the earth. Now you see that more clearly in Genesis 6 to 9, the story of Noah's flood, that human wickedness is increasing upon the earth, and God therefore decides to destroy all human beings with this devastating flood. But that means that animals will also be destroyed. So God asks Noah, the righteous man, to build an ark. And God says that he's going to send animals into that ark, and Noah has to bring food for himself and for his animals. All the clean animals, 7 pairs, clean birds, 7 pairs, unclean animals, 1 pair each. So these animals come into the boat. Noah saves them, feeds them for a whole year. When he comes out of the boat, in Genesis chapter 9, that's when man is allowed to eat meat. And it's very important to understand, although man is now allowed to eat meat, what is the implication? What are the implications? What's happening? Until that point, if you read Genesis chapter 1 to 9, you see 1 to 10, you see that human beings were living for 800 years, 900 years, for very long lives. And God says that now climate will change so drastically that our lifespan will be reduced to 120 years. The climate will no longer be able to sustain the kind of productivity and the kind of life that existed before the flood, which means that not only man will suffer, but animals will suffer. So after a year or so, when Adam and all these animals come out, we read that Noah offers an animal sacrifice to God. There is nothing else to sacrifice. There is no food. There is no fruit. The earth has just begun to grow grass and leaves. If the only way for animals to survive is for them to eat one another, or for man to eat some of the animals in order to be able to survive. So God says, okay, now I give you the animals to eat as I gave you green plants. What has happened? The climatic changes have been so dramatic that man now has to work much, much harder than before to grow food for himself and for animals. And he cannot grow it by himself. He needs the ox, he needs the cow, he needs the horse, he needs the camel to grow food. If you look today, and this is not just India, but we were in Minnesota for some time, cows and lambs and chickens simply cannot survive in Minnesota for 6 months of the year. In India, they cannot survive for 6 months of the year because there is no water to drink. They cannot dig wells, they cannot make canals. Just for water and for food, they cannot make warehouses and store food for themselves. They cannot cultivate enough food and gather it in barns to survive during those months when there is nothing to eat. So, man has to provide water, provide food, provide security, because these animals cannot protect themselves. They can't climb trees, they can't run very fast, they don't have fangs to fight. These chickens can't fly. When foxes come and cats come at night, they're on the trees and they will be eaten. Man has to offer protection to them. So we need them, they need us, we've become interdependent. If a shepherd is necessary for sheep to exist, then the shepherd has to live off the sheep. Let me explain that with a few very real experiences. Now, you hear that Indians are vegetarian, particularly if you read Mahatma Gandhi, you think that all Indians really are, because they are vegetarians, they love animals, they are kind to animals, it's the Westerners who are cruel to animals. But if you actually come to India with me, come to my hometown, we are driving, all of a sudden our car will be stopped in the middle of the road. Why? Because there is a whole crowd. What are they doing? Or they are watching a young man beat a cow with a big rod very mercilessly. The police is there, the crowd is there, nobody is stopping him. Why? Because they know what's happening. He has tried to teach this cow many times that his mother's basket of vegetables is not for the cow. But the cow is driven by hunger pangs and she keeps helping herself to that basket of vegetables. Why is she doing that? Because the cow is old, it no longer gives calf, it no longer gives milk. Cow slaughter is banned, you can't kill the cow. So what does the owner do? He is trying to feed his family. He can't possibly keep feeding the cow, so he lets the cow loose to help itself. The cow is in the city, tightly constructed buildings, there is nothing to eat, so it will eat whatever is possible. And if a old woman is sitting there with a basket of vegetables, if she turns her attention for a minute to something else, the cow would jump and help herself. Now this man is not cruel. He would gladly drink that cow's urine as an act of piety. He would worship that cow as a goddess, but today he is mad because he doesn't have any options. What do? You can't keep feeding these cows which are no longer economically profitable if they are not allowed to be eaten. Now, when we started serving the poor in this district, Chhatarpur, we found that 75% of our vegetable was coming from other districts, which was no reason. But also our district had no poultry. All the egg came from outside, and the reason for that was that keeping chicken was the task of the lowest caste of people. So no upper caste man who has the resources and could train himself to become a poultry keeper would keep a poultry. So we decided that, well, for the sake of protein, for the sake of agricultural economy, we need to break this custom and we need to have a poultry, and we need to teach people to keep more chicken. So we started a poultry. Now pretty soon we learn that from the eggs you don't get any profit. You might make a little bit of profit if you have managed your poultry very efficiently. At the end, when you sell a chicken for meat, then you make a little bit of money. Now, supposing you are against eating meat, eating poultry, what are your options? Well, one option is that when they stop laying eggs, you just let them go. If you let them go, then your neighbors will eat them, your cats will eat them, or foxes will eat them. Is that cruel? Are you being kind to the chicken who have given eggs to you for 1 year, 2 years? Well, you aren't being very kind to them. You're throwing them out to get killed. Your second option is to keep them in the room, don't feed them, let them starve to death. Because you don't want to eat them, but you can't afford to feed them either, you let them starve. Well, that's not very kind or gentle either. It's cruel. Your third option is to keep them in the room, keep feeding them. You keep feeding them for another 100 days, let's say 150 days, until they die of old age. Who pays for that food? You know, one egg might pay for 2 or 3 days, 4 days of feed. The only way you can keep feeding these chicken after they stop laying eggs is if you're willing to go bankrupt, or if you raise the price of egg 30 to 40 times. But at that price, nobody's going to buy your egg. So what do you do with these chicken? A vegetarian would say, well, this is a problem that you have created for yourself. There will be no problem if you don't have poultry, if you don't eat chicken, and if you don't eat eggs. Stop eating eggs, stop eating chicken. Then what happens to these chicken? Well, pretty soon they become an extinct species. Same is true of cows, same is true of lambs. If you don't take their milk, you don't take their leather, you don't take their meat, they become extinct species. Yes, let Mother Nature or evolution take care of them. They might then learn to fly or learn to run or learn to fight back and become aggressive and defend themselves. Well, that's blind faith in evolution, because any number of animal species, including dinosaurs, have become extinct and Mother Nature hasn't helped them. Evolution hasn't helped them to survive. Well, at least you will not be incurring bad karma by not being cruel to them. You haven't killed them, you have let them die. Nature is responsible, you aren't there. You aren't responsible. Well, that argument simply means that the people who say that they are concerned for animals are in fact concerned for their own good karma. They aren't concerned for animals. So, this is the real economic reality since the fall. Climate has changed, nature has changed. We are not living in Eden anymore. We are not living in a world as God had created it. We are living in a fallen world marred by sin. Therefore, certain evils have become necessary, which includes that the Good Shepherd, loves the sheep enough to protect them to the point of laying down his own life for them, feed them, give them water to drink. But then he has to live off those sheep. He has to eat them, he has to sell them. Otherwise, the option is that sheep will become an extinct species. This is why vegetarianism, religiously followed, is crueler to animals than non-vegetarianism, than eating meat. Jainism and Buddhism, particularly Jainism, which started the non-vegetarian diet, the Jains in India never cultivated farms, they weren't agriculturists, and they didn't look after poultry or dairy or animal husbandry because they just stayed away for their own righteousness. We don't look after animals. If they disappear, they disappear. It's all about me. It's all about my spirituality, my righteousness. I'm righteous because I don't eat animals. I don't look after them. So it is about you. It is not about animals. But those who believe that God created animals, loves the animals, created us to manage them, look after them. If the curse has come upon this earth, curse has come upon animals, it has come because of our sin. Therefore, now we need to look after them. We need to take care of them. We need to feed them. We need to protect them. We need to supply water and shelter for them. And in the process, unfortunately, we have to live off them. This is why the biblical tradition of eating meat started as animals being sacrificed to God. When a Jew wanted to eat an animal, he sacrificed it to God. That animal sacrifice was an acknowledgement that the animal belongs to God. God owns it. Now that was the point that God was making to Noah. When God said to Noah, that now I give you animals to eat, but it doesn't mean that God has stopped being interested in protecting animals. He is the one who asked Noah to make the boat to save them in the first place. So he obviously is interested in protecting them. Once he allowed Noah to eat them, he didn't stop being interested in protecting them. He said to Noah, I'm going to work on the instincts of the animals. The fear and dread of you will fall upon them. The birds will fly off from you. You want to love them, feed them, look after them, but they will run away from you because they are no longer going to trust you. Earlier, before the flood, they came into your boat. In the garden, they came to Adam, but now they're not going to come to you because the relationship has changed. Plus, when you do eat them, you should not eat their blood, because life is mine. When you drain off the blood that I can't eat, I'm not allowed to eat blood, it's the same command which Adam had, that don't eat from this particular tree. Because by not eating from that tree, you are acknowledging that this garden is God's. It's not my garden. I'm only a steward. By not drinking milk, by not taking the milk of the animals, you are acknowledging that life belongs to Him. He is the owner. I have the right to eat this animal, but I don't own these animals. He owns them. So, God, while He is giving animals to Noah and to his descendants, He is taking care to protect them. He is prohibiting eating of blood, which is a constant reminder that you don't own life, you only have been given the right to use life. And then God makes this covenant of the rainbow, not just for Adam, but that covenant of rainbow is for all life. God is once again blessing the animals, that I'm not going to destroy you. That's, if you read Genesis 9, it's very clear that God continues to care for animals. When you want to eat animal, you sacrifice it to God as an acknowledgement that life belongs to God. You eat it with gratitude. Now, the animal sacrifice does in fact degenerate into cruelty to animals, and therefore the prophetic challenge comes from Isaiah chapter 1, Isaiah chapter 66, David in Psalm 51, when he commits adultery with Bathsheba, he says, you do not desire sacrifices or offerings, otherwise I would bring them. You desire a broken heart, a contrite spirit. Isaiah says that I hate your sacrifices. In Isaiah 66, God says that whoever offers a lamb is like one who breaks the neck of a dog. Whoever offers a bull is like the one who is offering pig. I hate these sacrifices. And that's why Jesus says that loving God with all your heart, mind, strength, soul, and loving your neighbor as yourself is far more important than animal sacrifices. The true spirituality, for himself, Jesus says, summarized in Hebrews 10, that you did not desire animal sacrifices, you prepared a body for me. So I have come to offer myself as a sacrifice to you. And this becomes important for Paul, that you offer your bodies as living sacrifices to God. God wants you, your heart, your life. Don't try and appease him. He's not hungry for the blood of bulls and the meat of lambs. He wants you, your obedience. I desire mercy and love and justice and kindness, not sacrifices. That becomes the prophetic thunder throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And therefore, in the New Testament, the sacrifice of Jesus abolishes animal sacrifices, because sin has resulted in the curse, which has resulted in the fact that meat has to be eaten, animals have to be eaten. That isn't how God had created the earth, and that isn't what paradise is going to be all about. Isaiah gives us the picture of what the paradise would be when the wolf and the lamb, the lion and the cow will feed together, will live together with harmony. There will be a recreation of a new heaven and a new earth where there will be animals, but they will be in that Edenic state of relationships as God had intended. So, those who believe that God created all life, God created animals, He owns the animals, they hold animal life as sacred. And that's why a good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, because sheep are sacred, sheep are valuable. That becomes the image of the Son of God, a ministry. And that's what Jesus asks his disciples, Peter and John and James, to do. Feed my lamb, take care of my sheep, be a good shepherd. That's spirituality. So, cruelty to animals is evil. But the fact is that we live in an evil world. Now, to love animals, to serve animals, to save animals requires us to live off the animals. That's the ethics of eating meat. People who don't eat meat would not look after animals in this way. Where vegetarianism, if you become a Bill Gates, you can look after hundreds of thousands of old cows and chicken that don't give eggs and milk and calves anymore. But vegetarianism is a luxury, good luxury, but a luxury affordable on the blood and meat of other animals. Let me explain that. I mentioned that for months in India, animals cannot survive. Months in Minnesota, animals cannot survive without human care, the domestic animals, that is. There are any number of areas in this world, including in America, the desert areas, where the soil, there isn't irrigation system, there isn't canals, there aren't rivers, there aren't wells, the soil isn't producing vegetation of which human beings can live. But it is growing grass, it is growing herbs that can support sheep or the goats or some of these animals, camels or whatever. If we can provide water to them, protection to them and live off their milk and their cheese and their meat, then we can live in those inhospitable or unproductive parts. Once we begin to live there, then we can dig wells and we can build storage for rainwater and we can bring canals from 200-300 miles away. And then we can start irrigation projects to have greenhouses for vegetables as well as gardens in the desert. Then vegetarian diet is possible. So vegetarianism is a luxury which requires several generations of non-vegetarianism. So if you are able to live purely by vegetarian diet, you have to be thankful for those animals that gave their lives for making vegetarianism possible. You have to be thankful for your parents and ancestors who ate meat and went to this wilderness to make it possible for it to grow vegetables. You have no moral right to be proud that I'm righteous, I don't eat meat. The possibility that you can live without eating meat is there because your parents ate meat and your parents looked after those animals. So that is the ethics of vegetarianism. Let me conclude that contemporary vegetarianism is a reaction against modernism, is a reaction against a secular evolutionary point of view which looks at animals as products of blind chance without any intrinsic value or significance. And it sees life as a struggle for existence and survival of the fittest. So it's okay to kill and eat indiscriminately because that's what nature is all about. That's one perspective, and it is right for animal groups to react against it, that this is cruel, this is evil, to protest. And Christians shouldn't be defending, biblical Christians shouldn't be defending this secular, evolutionary, modernistic indifference, brutality to animals, because animals are God's valuable creation. They are precious. He loves them. He says in Proverbs, the righteous man takes care of his animals, but the kindest act of the wicked are cruel. Righteousness is to be like God. God was interested in blessing and protecting animals before the fall, before the flood, and even after the fall, when he allowed Adam and Eve to eat meat, he didn't stop being interested in saving animals, blessing animals, protecting animals. His rainbow is still a symbol that he has a covenant with animals. As his children, we are required to look after his creation, which includes animals. So we are the ones who should be championing the cause of the animals. It's sad that we leave it to those who would worship animals as gods and get into idolatry and intellectual and moral confusion. So let me stop here